Bien le bonjour and welcome to this second part of my video dedicated to the evolution of the warrior class and also the berserker through the main series of Final Fantasy. Fasten your seatbelt, here we go! And we are starting off with a game that didn't have a class system. So once again, to find a warrior, we needed to look at the design, stats and equipments associated with the character. Cloud Strife was the protagonist the closest to a warrior, with his huge two-handed weapons such as the iconic Buster Sword, but also due to his past as a member of Soldier who went through some body modifications and a tough training to become an elite fighter. His stats were a good reminder of this since he started with the highest strength and magic values. His limit breaks were all physically based, with only one of them dealing magical damages under some conditions. Finally, in FF14, his Buster Sword appears when the melee classes use their limit break level 1 or 2. All I said about Cloud Strife could be applied to Zack Fair, even if Cloud appeared at some points in the story. Meeting him unlocked the Meteor Shots DMW based on his Meteor Rain limit break from the original FF7. And yes, we are already done here. Even though each of the original cast members of FF7 made an appearance throughout the game, you could never control a warrior. Following the 7th episode's logic, the protagonist of FF8 deserving the label of the warrior could have been Squall Leonhart, since he started with the best physical defense and HP, as well as an assortment of limit breaks reminiscent of Cloud Strife's. He was also raised in a military school that trained soldiers, although it worked more like a mercenary army. However, since Final Fantasy XIV added the Gunbreaker job in the Shadowbringers expansion, I think I should dedicate a real but separate video to this. Sadly, there was no warrior here. But we had a knight, a job often shown as better than the warrior, the uptight Adalbert Steiner! He had the highest HP, defense and strength of all the characters, as well as being one of the only two who were able to equip heavy armors. Like all the other characters, he had his own skill set named Sword Art that comprised a few skills aimed at crippling enemy stats. Armor and Mental Break that affected respectively the physical and magical defenses of an opponent. Magic and Power Break that reduced respectively the magical and physical potencies of a monster. He also borrowed 2 AoE skills from other classes, but they worked on only one target this time. Darkside from the Dark Knight dealt dark type damages by sacrificing a bit of HP. Iai Strike from the Samurai, or Yainuki in Japanese, had a chance to instantly kill an enemy. On top of that, Steiner had a second skill set called Sword Magic that required to have the Black Mage Vivi in the party, alive and well of course. These skills enchanted Steiner's sword with the spell learned by Vivi to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The sword magic abilities appeared for the first time with the Mystic Knight in FF5, so we can easily conclude that Steiner was a mix of different variants of knight jobs. Despite the freedom granted by the Sphere Grid, each playable character was tied to a recurring role or job of the series, at least at the beginning. Following the culling process, Tidus was the closest to the warrior, mostly for his equipment comprised of swords and shields. Yes, it's not a lot to go by, since he didn't actually start with a lot of defense and HP, nor will get that much more in his side of the Sphere Grid afterwards. However, if we keep looking at those same base stats and Sphere Grid, we can see that it was more tuned toward speed, dodge, accuracy and strength, although he wasn't the best for the last two. All of this was enough to grant him a spot as a melee fighter. While his stats and his acrobatic fighting style could have made him look like a thief or a ninja, Riku was actually best deserving of that label, but this isn't the video for it. Another character was somewhat deserving of the warrior tag, Auron. Yes, I know, anyone with functioning eyes can see that Auron was more of a samurai, but please put those rotten tomatoes away and let me explain. He was the first protagonist to have access to the break skills from FF9, and his base stats were oriented toward strength, HP and defense, just like his side of the Sphere Grid. So he was the embodiment of the protector or tank side of the warrior.
There, did I convince you? No. Too bad, I'm protected by my screen anyway.
The warrior was one of the 4 dress spheres available at the beginning, and Pain had her warrior dress sphere as default design out of encounters. Regarding Yuna, who decided to get almost the same haircut as Tidus, she mimicked his moves when attacking or the victory pose, as well as some of his replies while using the warrior dress sphere. On top of it, her sword was Brotherhood, the iconic sword used by Tidus in FF10, at least in cutscenes. This job had rather high strength and defense stats, even if others were better, but it had the break skills from FF10 and especially Sentinel that would reduce physical damages to only 1 until your next turn. It also had access to a set of elemental skills like Steiner's sword magic in FF9 and the Mystic Knight in FF5 to exploit your opponent's weak points. If you were starting to miss the Berserker, well, let's rejoice, because there was a dress sphere of the same name. Boasting the highest speed and quite high strength, dodge and HP, it unfortunately had the worst defensive stats and magical attack. Strangely enough, as opposed to the FF5 job and Umarro in the 6th, this version of the class was entirely under your control like any other melee job with its own skill set called Instinct. 2 of them would make a fine addition to the Warriors collection. Crackdown, that nullified the 3 defensive buffs, Shell, Protect and Reflect at the same time on one target, and Unhinged, that lowered the opponent's accuracy and dodge stats. Of course, if that was too complicated for you, you could just use Berserk to self-inflict the Berserk status and let your heroine pummel your enemies by herself. Here, the warrior is one of the 6 starting classes when creating your character, just like in the original Final Fantasy. At low level, it's specialized in tanking since it is the only one able to wear the heavy armors between the first 6 jobs. It also has the Provoke skill, as well as Defender that lowers your attack by 25% while providing a 25% defense bonus. At higher level, the warrior can still be a good tank, but it is easily overshadowed by paladins and ninjas. I'm not making this up. The warrior goes back to being a melee DPS, a lot of its skills providing interesting benefits to other physical jobs like Aggressor, which improves its accuracy while lowering its evasion, or fittingly Berserk, that is the polar opposite of Defender, lowering defense to increase attack by 25%, fortunately without losing control of your character. Even as an active team member, the warrior can pull his weight since it brings some utilities to the party, such as Warcry that boosts the attack power of every ally in range, or Blood Rage that increases the critical hit rate of your party members. I said or because you can't have them both active at the same time and will always override the previous one. About the combat skills, the warrior is the most diverse in weapons proficiency. 13 different types of weapon with none of them lower than D, meaning that it's one of the best jobs to raise your side job skill caps. With A- proficiency in axes and being the only one with A+ in great axes, you can guess why they gave the latter to the warrior in FF14. Furthermore, some of the Great Axe weapon skills aim at reducing your opponent's stats, but only on the physical side. Attack, defense and evasion, as well as one last warrior exclusive skill that debuffs accuracy on top of the 3 stats previously mentioned all at once. In the original version, as every character could buy all the licenses, save for the Espers and Limit Breaks, there wasn't any real warrior, so we needed to pay closer attention to the character design and starting stats, equipments and licenses. Basch was a former Royal Knight with an overall rough appearance. He started with the highest HP and strength, as well as having already unlocked the licenses of axes, heavy armors and shields. All of this classified him as the warrior. In the Zodiac remakes, the Fu Breaker was clearly the warrior job with another coat of paint. It could equip the heaviest armors and a lot of shields, as well as having the exclusivity of axes and hammers. Although these types boasted the highest potency between all one-handed weapons, they had the huge downside of using a rather random damage formula, which in turn made this job kinda unreliable for sustained DPS. Its third weapon, the hand bombs, wasn't so much better since it had a similar damage formula to the first two, and to make things worse, you needed both hands, leaving you without the protection of a shield. I suppose the only reason why the Foebreaker had the hand bombs was so it could hit the flying targets. Check the description for a longer explanation. But good news, this job had access to the 4 skills that reduced enemy stats. All's well that ends well, right? Oh, before we hop onto the next game, I need to talk about the Berserk status that had another benefit here. It slightly raised your attack speed on top of your strength. Classified as arcane magic in the original version, then as time magic in Zodiac, you would once again lose any kind of control over the affected ally in both cases. Of course, it was better to use it on your strongest melee fighter, save for the leader, and absolutely not on your casters, don't you agree? Even though the melee units usually regrouped skills associated with melee classes or jobs from previous FF games, there was no warrior in the protagonist's roster. Not really a berserker, but the temporary character Bagamnan had the exclusivity of the berserk buff that he could apply on any ally, including himself. In this game, this status increased for 20 seconds the auto-attack damages and the movement speed of the unit, as well as its aggression because it would rush towards enemies standing farther than usual. And no, you did not lose control over the character, but its special skills would remain locked while the buff was active. And although I know this isn't really ending on a positive note, we're gonna stop here for today. Prenez soin de vous et amusez-vous bien!